How is it?
It's good.
It's good?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So before we get started, a couple quick things. One is you all probably noticed I've been wearing my glasses since about mid-October. I think what I've had is allergies. I'm not entirely sure, but I haven't been able to wear my contacts. And I tried wearing them on Thursday, and I wore them the whole day, and that was a bad decision.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, my eyes feel terrible. That's why we've got the lights off, and I might not do as well with the presentation today because of that, because I'm going to close them as often as I can. And hopefully we'll get through church after this without any problems. But if not, Jack's preaching.
Jack's going to be driving his Model A to Churchill for the Churchill Christmas house tour. So everyone is going to have to go to Churchill with him.
Oh, okay. Well, there you heard it. You heard it. All right, what I'd like to do, before we get started, I've already handed out the handout for today. Yes. Is there anyone who doesn't have it? Okay. Before we actually get into this Buddhist practice, I want to return for a second to this concept that we talked about last week of anatta, or anatma, of no soul or no self, and how each person is, in fact, from the Buddhist perspective, from Buddhist teachings, the coming together at any given moment of 5 aggregates or khandhas, which actually just means 5 heaps. These distinct things that come together, and then we, in our ignorance, identify the coming together of these 5 things as a permanent soul or self. And so I want to kind of talk about that a little bit more. I thought maybe a visual aid might help, because I feel like this is a crucial concept in Buddhism, but it's also one of the hardest to kind of wrap our minds around. That everything is anicca, or impermanence, including the coming together of the 5 khandhas. And in fact, in his teachings, the Buddha would often suggest that if you're going to identify something for the sake of, just kind of practical clarity, not as a permanent self, but just as if I'm going to be talking about myself, the thing that you should identify is not consciousness or mind, because these change so often. These are always changing. But if you're going to talk about something as being the referent for, at least for practical purposes of self, the best thing is your body. Because at least your body has a kind of perdurance, at least for a time. The body changes. Here, maybe if we pulled this back a little bit, it'll catch me. The body changes too, and presumably the Buddha. Is it still trained on me? Okay. Presumably the Buddha didn't know at his time about the fact that our cells are actually constantly changing. That in fact you're not the same conglomeration of cells that you were when you were born, except for maybe a few nerve cells, but that all of your cells are being shed and replaced by new cells, so that even your body isn't as permanent as you might like to think it is. I think the Buddha would love to have that knowledge, because it confirms what he thought. But if you're going to, for practical purposes, talk about some kind of self, he would say the body is better than mind or consciousness. But even then, it's still not permanent. The body changes eventually. It will die and decompose. So even that is not a permanent self. So I was thinking about how can we talk about these 5 kantas coming together at any given moment to create a being. And I thought maybe my visual aid would be this candle and the flame of the candle. So this is not an entirely flat surface, but hopefully it won't fall on me. All right, so we've got the wick. We've got the wax that holds the wick. We've got the candle holder that holds the wax, that holds the wick. We've got the oxygen, and I don't know anything about the chemistry of combustion, so this is about as deep as we're going to get into that. Otherwise, maybe talk to Sid. I just don't know. But anyway, and then we get the spark. And so now we have a lit candle. And so my question for you is, in this, if we were to think of this as a living being, as a human being, in the Buddhist perspective, what is the soul? The flame? Flame? Any other ideas? Is the flame?
The spark.
The oxygen? Okay.
It says, I don't know, the soul or the spirit. Now, maybe it's the whole thing and how
Maybe the whole thing?
how it lights up and
Mm-hmm.
the smoke.
The smoke, okay. So the smoke and the flame are really kind of the same thing, right? That's the same gas.
I would say the wick, because it
The wick?
didn't have the wick when it had the flame.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is a good example of how difficult it is to wrap your head around anatta, because in the Buddhist perspective, none of it represents soul, because there is no such thing as soul. Right? Even this flame, right? The wick is changing. It's being burnt. The oxygen is being, the oxygen is changing as it's being combusted, or as the wick's being oxidized in that way. Again, I don't know anything about combustion. The wax is melting. Even the flame itself is constantly changing. It's not the same flame as it was a second ago, right?
Yes.
Right. So there is nothing that has continuity, that has persistence in this way, that you could identify as soul. And that's what Buddha would say about you too. There's nothing about you that persists. So nothing that can be identified as Atman, as soul, as self, in any permanent sense. And so nirvana, or nibbana, means blowing out. What did I just blow out if this is a symbol for you, or for a human being?
You blew out the flame.
Right, what's the flame represent?
Life.
Not life, desire, craving, tanha. From the Buddhist perspective. Nirvana is the blowing out of craving. When there is no craving, there's knowledge that there's no craver, no one who does the craving. No self, no soul. Okay? It's a tough concept, but it's crucial for understanding Buddhist teachings in general, but also for understanding Buddhist practice. What is the purpose of meditation? Because the purpose of meditation in Buddhism, for example, is not the same thing as the purpose of meditation in Jainism, and it's not the same thing as the purpose of meditation in Hinduism. And you need to understand that these concepts of anicca, or impermanence, and anatta, no self or no soul, to understand what the purpose of meditation is. And we'll talk about the purpose of meditation this morning. Let me give this to Beth. So it's absolutely crucial that you understand this no soul, because there were two prevailing opinions at the time of the Buddha. One of them you find represented in the Upanishads that then gets picked up by, for example, the Advaita Vedanta school of Hinduism, which is that you are to identify your true self with the one thing that doesn't change, which is the Atman, this first-person perspective that can even be aware of your own consciousness. That's what you're supposed to identify with. And the Atman you recognize is, in fact, eternal and unchanging, and is Brahman, the very ground of all being in the universe. All right, Buddha is intentionally rejecting that perspective. There is no Atman. And he doesn't say this, but the corollary might be that there is no Brahman. There's no underlying ground of being for the universe. Everything is impermanence. Everything is changing. This is crucial. The other perspective that was dominant in his day that he was rejecting was the idea of annihilation. That when you reach moksha or liberation, or if you want to call it nirvana or nibbana, you're blowing out the self. That you do have a self that keeps going and going and going, but what you want to do is end or annihilate the self. And that's what nirvana or nibbana is. And Buddha's saying, no, that's missing the point also. You're not annihilating the self. You're not ending the self. There was no self, no soul to annihilate. No self or no soul to end, to be freed from the cycle of samsara. There's only craving that gets blown out. All right, so that brings us into Buddhist practice, which is what we're actually going to talk about today. So we'll start with a story from the Buddha's life, which will introduce to us the idea of the three jewels, or the three gems, and the Triple Refuge. Not long after his very first sermon in the Deer Park near Benares at Isipatana, when the Sangha was really just the Buddha and his five, he comes to call them bikkhus, his five ascetic friends that he had trained with before his enlightenment. A rich young man, the son of a wealthy merchant named Yasa, was in a very similar situation as Siddhartha had been in. He had everything that he ever wanted. He lived in a palace of pleasure, and one night everyone falls asleep, and he awakes in the early morning light, and he sees all the dancing girls and servants and attendants asleep where they had been partying the night before. And in their sleep, in this kind of twilight in the morning, they just look to him to be disgusting. He sees them sleeping, but they look like corpses lying on the ground. And he's brought to mind of how corpses die and decay, and go into the earth. And so he's so sickened by the sight that he leaves his household, and he's able to kind of get away without anybody stopping him. And he makes his way, without really knowing where he's going, to the deer park near Benares, where the Buddha is staying at the time, having just begun to turn the wheel of Dhamma. He meets the Buddha, and the Buddha teaches him the Dhamma, what we've already talked about, the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path. Everything is dukkha, everything is suffering, everything is impermanent. Well, he's convinced by this, and he wants to learn more. But his father comes after him. The wealthy merchant comes looking for him. And so the Buddha, who has supernormal powers, makes Yasa invisible, so his father can't see him. And his father says, hey, you look like a wise guy. Have you seen my son anywhere around here? And the Buddha says, well, let me talk to you first. And he teaches him, the wealthy merchant, the Dhamma. Well, the father, the merchant, is so pleased by the Dhamma that he's ready to provide food and all sorts of things that the Buddha and his bhikkhus need. And at that time, the Buddha lifts the cloak of invisibility, and there is Yasa. And Yasa becomes the next bhikkhu, so now there's 7 bhikkhus in the Sangha. But importantly, after hearing the Dhamma proclaimed to him, Yasa's father says, I go to the Buddha for refuge. I go to the Dhamma for refuge. I go to the Sangha for refuge. These are known as the 3 jewels, or the 3 gems, and the Triple Refuge. The Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Sangha is the community, particularly the community of bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, or monks and nuns, but also the lay disciples, or the lay devotees in Buddhism. This triple refuge is something that Buddhists still say. It's, in fact, and I've given you the Pali on there, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce. But they'll say it 3 times. For example, when they go to a Buddhist shrine, or they're meeting with a Buddhist monk, they'll say, I go to the Buddha for refuge, I go to the Dhamma for refuge, I go to the Sangha for refuge, or I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dhamma, I take refuge in the Sangha. And then they'll say, again, I say, or a second time I say, I go to the Buddha for refuge, a second time I go to the Dhamma for refuge, a second time I go to the Sangha for refuge. A third time I go to the Buddha for refuge. A third time I go to the Dhamma for refuge. A third time I go to the Sangha for refuge. And they say it, of course, in Pali. Well, anyway, this is something that is still said by Buddhists today. And in fact, let's hope that this isn't the case. But if in my discussing Buddhism with you, you have suddenly decided that you want to convert and you want to become a Buddhist, what do you have to do to become a Buddhist? Do you have to go through some sort of ritual like baptism, some kind of sacramental act? No, nothing like that. All you do is take the Triple Refuge and the 3 jewels, and then try and live by the 5 precepts. So, let's take a quick look at the 5 precepts. So that's down under the category of sila, or right action, or morality. It's the Panca-sila, the 5 precepts. These are to abstain from taking life, to abstain from stealing, to abstain from adultery, to abstain from false speech, and to abstain from intoxicants and drugs. So, I said that the Triple Refuge, if I had actually meant it and intended it, and if I was ready to give up beer, and maybe become a vegetarian, depending on how you understand the first of the 5 precepts, I could be a Buddhist right now. I did not intend the Triple Refuge when I said it, and I'm not going to give up beer. But there you go. That's how you become a Buddha, or a Buddhist. I'm sorry. It takes a lot more to become a Buddha. All right. Now, let's say you are going on a retreat. One of the things that's often done is for Buddhists to, if they're serious about their practice, to go on retreat with a monk or monks with a bikkhu, and to work on their meditation during this retreat. And they may do it with other people, and sometimes these are one-day retreats, and sometimes they're longer than that. They could be even weeks. In some Theravada countries where Theravada Buddhism is prevalent, young men will actually go and take retreat for more than a year. I don't know exactly how long, but will actually live as a monk for a period of time before they move on with the rest of their life. So what do you do? What precepts do you have to take if you're going to go on retreat? Well, it's the same 5 with a few others and a slight variation on those 5. Instead of just abstaining from adultery, you abstain from all sexual activity when you're on retreat. And in addition to those 5, you abstain from eating solid food after midday. So in other words, you have your 1 meal a day, and it's before noon. You abstain from seeking entertainment and the wearing of perfumes, jewelry, and other personal adornments. And you abstain from using, in the one translation, this one book that I was reading, it says luxurious beds, but what I've heard is what they mean is just soft beds, you know. It's okay if the bed's hard, but if the bed's too soft, you have to just lay on the ground. And high seats, and by high seats, that doesn't mean high chairs like babies sit in or bar stools. That means what you're sitting in now, right? Seats that elevate you up off the ground like this, instead of just perhaps a little pad that you sit on the ground. So these are the 8 precepts if you're going on retreat to work on meditation, or what should really be said, called mind cultivation. Well, what about if you want to go ahead and become a bikkhu or a bhikkhuni, if you want to become a monk or a nun? Well, just add to these 8 precepts 219 more, and you can be a bikkhu. They have 227 rules as part of their patimokkha. And of course, if you want to be a bhikkhuni, if you want to be a nun, well, there's a few more. They have altogether 311 rules as part of their patimokkha.
Why is that? Why? Are there more for the...
Why are there more? Well, there's more for monastics of any tradition, right? I mean, Christian monks and nuns take on vows that lay Christians don't take on, right? Or even that if you're in a religious order in the Roman Catholic Church and you're a priest, you take on vows that you don't have to take on if you're what's known as a secular or diocesan priest in the Roman Catholic Church. Why more for nuns?
Okay.
I want to answer in a way that isn't doesn't cast any aspersions Buddhism, but let's just say that typically in human history, we have put more rules around women than we have around men in general, right? Women need to be more controlled from the perspective of patriarchal society than men do. And I'll just leave it at that.
Where can you read those rules?
I suspect you could find them online, but also, if you want to search for, they're in the Tipitaka, in the actual collection of Buddhist scriptures, the Pali Canon. So if you search for translation of that, for example, on Amazon, I'm sure you can find it. And some of them are, we're talking about rules that govern just like, daily life and interaction. So you're not, if you're looking for profound wisdom, it's probably not going to be there that you're going to find it. Where you would look for profound wisdom is the actual teachings of the Buddha, not in the rules for how a monastic community is supposed to be arranged, right? Well, that at least I wouldn't look for profound wisdom in that, but some people do.
Are the structures for monastic communities drawn from the necessities of what's needed in a monastic community, or are they drawn from like a different culture or different religions and things like that? Like Buddhism might have influenced Christian monasteries or something for the rules.
I don't think there's any influence of Buddhism on Christian monasticism. I think they developed fairly separately of each other. But there are certain things, that people learn as they live together that are just going to be true no matter who you are and where you live and what time period you live in. So I'm sure there's overlap, but I don't think that there's influence. Christian monasticism developed quite a bit later and in a very different kind of cultural context. Now, the idea of asceticism and of separating yourself in a sense from society and collecting in communities that do this, that is going on in India. It looks like before you see it happening, for example, in the Middle East with the Essenes and in the Roman Empire. So there may have been some influence in that sense, just in general, that groups of people kind of separating themselves and taking on ascetical disciplines together. There may have been some influence that came in that direction. But it's hard to say whether or not that's the case. How are we doing on time?
10 minutes,
We've got 10 minutes?
I think,
Okay.
maybe.
Yeah, it's 9:42.
Okay, well let's move on then. Let's move along. There's so much more to Buddhist practice than we're actually going to get into today, and I'm just trying to hit some of the highlights. There's things that I'm not going to talk about, like, there are Buddhist temples, and there's a kind of like puja for the statues of the Buddha at the Buddhist temples that is not like what happens in Hinduism, because in Hinduism you actually, there's a belief that you can call down the presence of the deva into the statue. What's come to be called in the West, theurgy. That's not true in Buddhism, because when the Shakyamuni Buddha died, he attained what's called paranibbana. He had attained nibbana in his life. He had blown out tanha, or desires, craving. And so at his death, he attained Nibbana, which is Nibbana without remainder, without anything left. See, while he was still alive, he still had the 5 khandhas coming together for his life. But after his death, no more khandhas coming together, right? No more kama to draw them together. So you can't draw down the Buddha into a Buddhist statue through prayers and rituals, the way in Hinduism you can draw down the deva into the statue of the deva. And yet there's still puja, there's still things that are done before and for the statues of the Buddha. So we won't get into that. Instead, what I want to focus on is the cultivation of mind, which was so important for the Buddha himself. He himself never talked about puja for devas or statues or anything like that. He wasn't interested in that. He was interested in cultivation of the mind. In fact, one thing that you may have noticed is, so far we've talked a lot about Buddha's teachings, and Buddha, in all of this talk, you haven't heard anything about a god or the gods, the devas, right? In the story of his life, the devas kind of play a little bit of a part, right, in the kind of mythos of the Buddha. But in his teachings, there's nothing about a god or Brahma or Brahman or anything like that, right? No creator, nothing like that, because everything's impermanent. And his teaching is all about the practical. It's all about the cultivation of mind. So first of all, he says there are the, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, the Brahma-vihara, the supreme dwelling, or the 4 states of consciousness that every Buddhist is supposed to try and cultivate. These are metta. Metta literally means friendship. So friendship with all living beings, or it's often translated as cultivating a consciousness or a conscious goodwill towards all living beings. There's karuna, or compassion for all living, all sentient beings. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but there's mudita, or sympathetic joy in the happiness and success of other beings. That is, whenever some other being attains happiness or success, progresses in the Eightfold Path, anything like that, you cultivate a sense of sympathetic joy. You're happy for that other being rather than being jealous or envious or covetous of these other beings. And finally, upekkha, or equanimity. So in the vicissitudes of life, as things go up and things go down, and there's good times and bad times, you're not attached to any of it. You're not attached to the good times, you're not attached to the bad times. When things are going well for you, that's fine. When things are going poorly for you, that's fine. You maintain equanimity of mind. And you can achieve these states through Bhavana, or mind cultivation, and this is often what gets translated as meditation. Now, when the Buddha was learning from Alara Kalama, and when he was learning from Udaka Ramabutta, he was learning a type of meditation that already existed, was already practiced in India at that time. The type that's often associated with Hinduism, that's known as samadhi in Sanskrit, or samatha in Pali. This is traditional Indian meditation. It is the cultivation of concentration, or what they say is developing one-pointed mind, where you are entirely focused on one thing. And this is said to produce the deep states of samadhi or samatha, known as dhyana or jhana. These are trance-like states, which is the goal of meditation in Hinduism, because that's where you realize that you are, for example, Atman, and Atman is Brahman. But this is not the goal of meditation in Buddhism. And so the Buddha developed a second form of meditation. Once you have attained or developed this one-pointedness of mind, then you can begin vipassana, or insight meditation. Vipassana means seeing in various ways. And this is particular to Buddhism. In this, you want to cultivate sati, or mindfulness. You don't want to get caught up in trance-like states. You don't want to get caught up in the bliss of jhana or jhana. Instead, you want to detach yourself from those blissful states produced through that kind of meditation and get drawn back into being aware or mindful of just what you're doing. And this can actually be extended beyond the sitting meditation. This can be done. They have a lying meditation, a walking meditation, an eating meditation. You remember I said when I met with the Buddha, he said everything is meditation, right? Because he is trying to cultivate sati, or mindfulness, of everything he does. So everything for him is vipassana. Everything is meditation in this sense.
It's 10 till.
It's 10 till? Okay. How about we, I won't go through how you do it, but I've put that down here, but I do want to say for a second, so as you cultivate mindfulness or sati, you focus on kaya, the body, mindfulness of body, vedana, or mindfulness of feelings and sensations, citta, or mindfulness of your own mind, of your states of consciousness, and Dhamma, that is mindfulness or concentration on the teachings of the Buddha or other ethical and intellectual subjects. And there's a little bit that I left on here accidentally on your sheet from last week when I forgot to. So that whole bit about tanha there, you can just mark that out. That was I used the same formatting from last week, and so a bit of it stayed on there. So the foundational practice of meditation, of vipassana meditation, is known as anapanasati, and again, forgive the pronunciation, I'm sure I'm getting that wrong. But this is the meditation on the breathing in and breathing out. And it's this particular meditation that they suggest sitting, particularly if you can, if you're flexible enough. You sit cross-legged, your back straight but not rigid. And your hands resting on your lap. You often see the Buddha with his hands like this, resting on his lap, right? And the statues. And you just pay attention. The breath comes in, you pay attention to that. The breath goes down into your lungs, fills your lungs, you pay attention to that. You focus on the abdomen expanding. The abdomen then contracts. The breath goes out of the lungs. You're mindful of the breath leaving you, and just over and over and over again. Now, of course, what happens as you try and do this, as you try and maintain your mindfulness of your breathing in and your breathing out, is that your mind will wander, especially early on as you practice vipassana meditation. You'll find within a few seconds your mind is wandering. It may move to passing thoughts. Did I leave the stove on? Did I lock myself out of my car? It may move to sensations. There's an itch on my shoulder or something like that, right? This is really uncomfortable sitting this way. I'm not flexible enough. It may move to perceptions, or where you particularly, let's say, somebody's baking a pie in the kitchen. You smell it. You think, ooh, apple pie, right? Or it may, any of these things, your mind may jump around to, like the dog in that movie, what was that Pixar or Disney movie with the old man in the house that flies away with the balloons? You know what I'm talking about? Anyway, and the dog who has a thing that allows him to speak, and he's always in the middle of saying something, squirrel, right? That's your mind. And as you do this, you don't judge it and you don't try and force yourself back to the breath. You acknowledge, you're mindful of this thought is passing, this sensation I'm feeling, this I'm perceiving this thing. And you pay attention to it. You name it, you acknowledge it, you let it pass, and after it's passed, then you move back to your focus on breathing in and breathing out. You don't try and force your attention back. You're mindful of what happens, and then you move back to the breathing. And we'll end there.